This is Charlie Gazik, Chair of the Newcastle Planning Commission, calling the meeting of February 22nd to order. Will you all join me in a salute to the flag? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. First order of business is the approval of the agenda. Does anyone have any changes, or is the agenda as presented?
Chair Gatzig,
Okay.
should we have a roll call?
Yes, we should. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. So we'll call the roll.
Okay, Vice Chair Kennard.
Present.
Let's see, Commissioner Marsh,
Present.
Commissioner Quigg,
Present.
Commissioner Dantzler,
Present.
Commissioner Lowe, and Commissioner Van Atta appear to be absent. Chair Gatzig.
Present.
That's 5 present, Chair.
If there's no objection, we will mark Commissioners Lowe and Van Natta absent. They are out of town today. Okay. All right, now we can approve the agenda or make any changes if any are desired. Would anyone like to change the agenda? Yeah. And we shall consider it approved and move to the minutes of January 25th. You've had a chance to review them. Does anybody have any changes or corrections to the minutes? Heads shaking no, so we will consider them approved. That brings us to the public comment period. We have no one in the audience from the general public other than a guest speaker tonight. Is there anybody online, or is there anyone in the audience here who would like to make a public comment?
There's nobody online.
Okay, then we will close the public comment period and open it up to the commissioners for any comments that they wish to make. And commissioners, just feel free to jump in if you have a comment.
I just wanted to say we got a new police chief who I've seen at Risdon Middle School and attended a recent HOA meeting, and we're thrilled to have him back in Newcastle. So that's terrific.
Okay, no other comments then. Moving to reports, the commission chair has no report. We'll turn to the community development director, Mr. Hoffman. Would you like to make a report?
No new report. I'll discuss the item under 9.2 later. Thank you.
Brings us to general business, and the main portion of our agenda tonight, well, one of the main portions, which is a discussion of the missing middle housing. And with that, I will turn this back over to staff, to Senior Planner Fitzgibbons or Director Hoffman, to introduce our speaker.
Just to start off, this is a continuation of your prior meeting where you were introduced at a very broad scale of what you're facing as a commission this year primarily, and that's the periodic update. We also have other grants from Department of Commerce to look at missing middle housing, displacement, and a variety of other things that will tie into that conversation. But just like in your last meeting, we wanted to start broadly and work our way into it. What is the overall effort, so that it gives you a context of what the city's facing, and then educate and involve you at a very early portion so that we can be productive and get you what you need. So in line with that, what we have for you tonight, relatively brief, is some repetition from that prior meeting. Some of this you've heard before, but also to carry it one level further. So we have a guest presenter tonight, Shane Hope, prior professional planner in a variety of cities, but right now working for Department of Commerce as our representative in this effort, sort of the ombudsman or liaison position as we go through this as a community. So the presentation is Shane's tonight, and then we're available for any questions on this item. And at the tail end of that, we'll be asking you, where do we go next? And I'll give you some update then. So with that, Shane Hope.
Very good, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate this
the body that's been thinking about all these things, and I'm here to help you keep moving along. And I know that you've already heard from your director and senior planner on a number of issues, so we'll just build a little bit and keep going. So I think you've got screens, so I'll just be looking up here a little bit. And we're going to start out by talking about the housing element, just one part of your comprehensive plan and the changes that, that need to be thought about. So with that, I forgot I could do that, but anyway. So my agency, Department of Commerce, it's had various names in the past, but basically it represents a lot of different types of programs. So growth management and community planning is just one part of it, but it does all kinds of other things from energy and economic development and much more. But I'm here specifically about housing. So we're going to go just a little bit back over the Growth Management Act, what it's about, how it relates, and about the new housing requirements that are facing all of our communities today, and a little bit about some of the outreach work we've done and some of the things that we anticipate for the future in being able to help communities, in addition to identifying some of the things you'll be working on. And you may have more questions and ideas as we go along. So the Growth Management Act, you probably know, was adopted in 1990, and it was a way to try to begin to get a better handle on kind of the growth issues. Before that, we also in this state had a lot of growth, but not much management side. So there were a lot of issues with sprawl, about losing our critical areas, our wetlands, and all of those things. Not a very cohesive planning platform for communities, so everybody was busy doing their own thing, and it wasn't working real well. So the state legislature and the governor got together, and there was lots of public input, and over time developed the Growth Management Act. It has 14 goals, and one of them is housing. None of the goals are superseding each other. They're meant to work together. And deal with the quality of life and the needs that are here in our communities. So there's state guidance and some requirements, and then there's some local flexibility to carry out those things, and at the same time recognize the things that come to the forefront of needing to be some consistency in what communities do. So with that, we'll keep moving. I think you know that, as I mentioned, there are 14 broad goals to the Growth Management Act and then a number of provisions. And of course, the Growth Management Act isn't the only planning law we have in our state. There's Shoreline Master Plan Management, and then there's SEPA, the State Environmental Policy Act. There's watershed planning and other things that go on too. So, but this is the act that probably pulls together the most things, the Growth Management Act. So again, goals and some broad direction and some requirements are part of the Growth Management Act. One of the requirements is that every county have a set of countywide planning policies, and the cities have some input on that. Also then for the broader region, particularly the Central Puget Sound region, there's multi-county planning policies. So I'm sure you've heard of Puget Sound Regional Council and the work that they do. Again, that's starting at one level down from the state about some policy direction for the region, but it's not as specific as happens at, say, the county level, a little bit notched down on King County, and then it's really at the city level where a lot of things play out, and we get into the details and the specificity about what works for the community. So there's a comprehensive plan, and then there are the development regulations that must implement and be consistent with that comprehensive plan. So the regulations are kind of the rules, and the comp plan is the vision and the policy, general policy direction. But that all plays out in real life. So just a reminder on the updates required. Of course, there need to be periodic updates. The next update is due for comprehensive plans and development regulations at the end of 2024 for our region. And again, a reminder about the required components of a comprehensive plan. So for cities, 5 things are components or elements, sometimes they're called, are required: land use, transportation, housing, capital facilities, utilities. Those are the 5 for cities. Many cities also have other elements: economic development or climate action and a variety of things like that, but these are the ones that are required. We'll keep going. And I think you all know that housing has been an issue in this state and in this region for quite a while. I think we're all aware that housing has gotten even more expensive, more difficult to find enough housing. And so recognizing all these needs and the fact that people, particularly if you have less than the median income, you really can be struggling. And so the state legislature looked at that and said, well, we've got to do more. We can't just say, just go out and do your best, because that hasn't been working too well. So we also recognized, the state recognized, the legislature, that the rate of home ownership for people of color, households of color, was much lower than for white households, non-Hispanic households. And the difficulty of finding available housing was much more difficult for folks in the lower income brackets. No surprise. So the state legislature adopted a bill, HB 1220, which amended the Growth Management Act to get a little more robust and to strengthen the way that communities deal with some of these issues. So, for example, the goal, which had been, really broad in the Growth Management Act, used to say, encourage the availability of affordable housing. Okay, that's nice. What do you do with that? So the state legislature said, well, let's ramp that up. Let's make that a little more active, not just encourage and think about it, plan for and accommodate housing that's affordable to all economic segments. And our agency, Commerce, was required then to put together an assistance program and to provide some data that would be helpful to communities as they're trying to think about, well, what do we need to do? What do we have to accommodate? How much? So our data was trying to look at all income levels, from very low, extremely low, and moderate incomes, as well as more affluent segments of the population. And to think about, this is assigned by the state legislature, to think about, well, what about those folks that need kind of more permanent services, not just housing, but they need social services help or physical help with their day-to-day living. How much of that does our state need? So we set about with this small task. And again, how does that relate to the planning work that you're doing? Well, remember that housing element that you already have, but will need to be thinking about how to update it. In that, you're working to identify sufficient land capacity for whatever those numbers are of housing units. Not only just a pure number, but the types of housing that might be available to people of different income levels. So we know, for example, obviously, $1.5 million homes are not going to be affordable to everybody. So there needs to be something besides that available. And within urban growth areas, and every city is an urban growth area, you need to look at and provide for moderate density housing too. And that includes things like what we call middle housing. So duplexes, triplexes, and townhomes, and so on. And then also to be identifying, well, what are the barriers to more people getting housing that's closer to being affordable or attainable? What are those barriers? What barriers are in place? How have they come about? Can they be modified to be less restrictive to allowing more people to have a home? So again, trying to think through all those different levels and the different types of housing that might be available for different income levels and how that relates to proximity to jobs or services and infrastructure and so on, as well as accessory dwellings. Could accessory dwelling units play a part in providing for housing needs? So this new bill that amended the Growth Management Act went on to talk about local policies and regulations that should be in place. Again, not spelling out exactly what they are, but giving some direction about what needs to be tackled. So that would include zoning issues, disinvestment if that's occurred. Now that might not be the case for disinvestment in Newcastle, a relatively newer city, but for some older cities that could be a big issue. So it's looking at what your issues are. Infrastructure availability, maybe. But what are the things that have resulted in maybe not having an equitable distribution of people of different races and income levels and so on? What is it that's maybe preventing that or influencing that? And are there things that the city can do to begin to undo some of those impacts? Knowing that no city can create the world over, but are there things that can be done to help? So identifying those areas that are maybe at risk right now. Again, this might not particularly apply to Newcastle, but it would to some cities if there are high-risk areas where people might be displaced shortly from their housing. If that was an issue, that would be something you should look at. And then, again, we've worked on the housing needs. So after looking at Office of Financial Management, population projections, and studying other things, and working with consultants and so on, our agency came up with county-wide numbers for the next 20 years, out through 2044. And we did at a county-wide level, so it's not saying here's what each city should do, but here's at a county-wide level what the need is. So, for example, we can see that for the next 20 years in King County, there needs to be a total of 1.26 million, million more homes, more units altogether. That's the bulk of that's the total for the state. And then when we get into the county, our county, King County, has the most people to allocate and plan for, it's not the total. So looking at the totals then, we're looking at, you see up on your chart, it says non-PSH. Well, that means not permanent supportive housing. So we have some special numbers for PSH. That's the permanent supportive housing. I think there's a recognition, let me just interject here, that cities aren't necessarily going to go out and build permanent supportive housing, but cities do have the ability to make it possible for that to be built by someone who does have some funding. So that's the challenge with that. Can you go back just a second? Sorry. And so it goes from there. And what about 30 to 50% of the area median income? Well, there's a lot of housing need there too. We're talking about 130, almost 140,000 new units needed at that level, 30 to 50%. And then we go on up to say 120% of area median income. So 100 to 120%. We need 135,000 of those units and so on. So it's a lot. Now, thinking about what the total numbers are, and then thinking about, well, what do these different income levels mean? Excuse me?
I apologize for interrupting. I just keep looking at the prior slide. I just want to make sure I understand what I'm looking at.
Let's go back.
So are the numbers in the white?
The numbers in the white are the
total need.
Total need.
And the numbers in the gray
gray down there
row,
is
those
what
are
we need.
additional.
That's the gap. Those are the gap numbers. So thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you for
I
the
can see why
clarification.
that might not have been clear. So that's the gap. And when we think about, well, what's area median income anyway? I think you know that median refers not to average, but to half being lower and half being higher if you count out the numbers of households. So it's a little fairer understanding than just average, which would take into account the billionaires, et cetera. So the area median household income per year in King County as of 2021 was $110,556. So that's a median household, which, you know, we've got different sizes of household, 1, 2 people, and sometimes more, but that's just the median. And then if you really look at the low income level, say 30% of that, that would be a household that makes up to $33,167. And there are people who make that kind of money and are trying to deal with housing issues. Or you go up to 50% of area median income. That would be a little over $55,000 a year. Now it's still tough. At 80%, you're getting into kind of the moderate category. That would be an household income of $88,445, okay? So somewhere above 50% is where the market might be able to find housing if it's available. Anything below that probably will end up needing subsidies from somewhere. So that's a big issue in itself. And I think our state and our federal government are trying to look at ways to come up with more money. We've got nonprofits that are also working on those issues. But we need to at least make it possible. So that's where we're going. And again, local governments have a key role in this. Local governments control a lot about the land supply, about the cost of building, not all the costs, but some costs. And then our state agencies are trying to be helpful, provide you support in the background, information and data. So for example, we've worked on this allocation tool to show what's the county-wide need. We recognize that then it's up to the county and the cities to work together to figure out how to share that, how to reasonably share those big numbers among each community. And find some agreement and keep moving. But the numbers will be sizable. I'm not going to minimize it. It's not like, oh, I've got to find another 100 houses. No, it's going to be more. And so there'll be a lot of things that you'll want to consider as part of your planning process. You've got choices where maybe you have some areas that are fairly close to transit or some other amenities that are convenient. Maybe that's where a little bit more density goes, where there's a little bit more mixed use opportunities, places that more people can be. And then we have our residential neighborhoods, primarily in a lot of those, that means a lot of detached housing. But in some cases, that can also be a place for the so-called middle housing, kind of the smaller scale stuff, a duplex or other smaller types of middle housing. And there could be some other ideas as well. And of course, ADUs are a possibility too, but not the whole answer. So reminder about, well, why do we call this housing middle? As I think you probably know from your last meeting, this kind of housing, that is, as you can see on the graphic, starting with duplexes and on up to smaller, small-scale apartments, used to be built. It was common in cities, and if you go to any of the older cities, you'll see neighborhoods where you've got detached housing, and you've got some duplexes and triplexes and maybe some small apartments, all mixed in there, and they're often work pretty well. But those got basically zoned out for lots of reasons. There were banking things that happened, redlining that happened, and other things that converged to preclude people from building those kinds of units and restricting it to only single family in huge chunks of each city. So commonly that's 2/3, 3/4 of the entire city's land area. So that's why there is some opportunity. Will it work everywhere? No. But can it work somewhere? Can it make a difference? Probably. So again, you have multi-county planning policies that apply to your community and others in the region. Just one example of what Vision 2050 says is for cities and to achieve and sustain a sufficient supply of housing to meet the needs of middle income, low income, folks with different needs, and to promote home ownership opportunities for, again, people with a range of different needs. And in the King County countywide planning policies, again, covering your community as well as others, identify sufficient land for housing of all income levels and different needs, including duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, increase the housing choices for everyone, and expand the range and supply of housing types. It's not just one size for everybody or one type for everybody. We did a survey recently, our agency, state agency, trying to get a handle, well, what do people think? We know that housing is a pretty big issue. Is it big to everybody? I mean, maybe sometimes when we're working at a government level or in various jobs, we're aware of things, but what does the average person think? So we did a random survey, had a professional company do a random survey for us, and we found that housing, cost of housing and homelessness were the biggest issues across the state. That wasn't just Western Washington or the Central Puget Sound region, that was across the entire state. And people that answered the questions, again, this random survey, 78% said that they wanted more options, more housing options for people in what I would call the moderate income level, moderate and average childcare workers, seniors, teachers, those kinds of folks. And most people wanted the new housing to be in areas that were walkable where possible. 77% said rents are too high. 75% said the cost of buying a house is too high. House or condo, whatever it is that home is. 83% felt that more reasonably priced housing was needed in their communities. So we saw strong statewide support, and I was wondering how this would turn out, but it showed that the majority of people, 2/3 of people said, well, we need more diverse and affordable housing types, not just single-family detached housing, even though that will continue to be an important part, but we need some other options too. And more than half also said that even in detached areas of detached housing, there should be options for some other types of middle housing, like triplexes, for example, that meet the standards of the zone. And residents said, well, government really should do more. It's not all up to government, of course, but there are things that governments can do, and agencies should work together to help meet some of these needs and help with the things that the market isn't providing. So that's it in a nutshell. There's lots more details on our website, so if you're interested, you can go into our agency website and read the whole thing. We have a dashboard and everything, so lots of information there. Now, with all of that, well, what is the local city's responsibility? I think you know this. You know that you have a comprehensive plan and you have development regulations that make a difference in what kind of housing is available or will be available in the future. And you're thinking not just about this year or next year or 4 years from now, but the whole range, at least 20 years. How are we going to position ourselves for the future? We found that we need statewide more than 1 million new homes. And those can be different. Some of them will be detached standalone houses, some of them will be condos, some of them will be, duplexes, whatever, a range of things, multifamily. But cities can work on those issues and see where they can make a difference. And consider some incentives or other opportunities. And I know you as a city have already done some of that. For example, working with Arch, that's a good thing. That's an example of a partnership. You've looked at incentives. For example, I know you have a multifamily tax exemption program to encourage a type of housing that isn't as common here. So that's positive. So you're already doing some of the things, and it's looking to see what else can be done. And then continue coordinating with your other, with the other agencies that work on these issues together. You do have a grant, and I think Marcus mentioned that. We have a grant for middle housing in particular. That's why I'm here today, talking about some of the things that are to consider as part of this middle housing, and I'll talk a little bit more detail in a minute. And then you have a periodic update grant, and that's for the big overarching update on your comprehensive plan and regulations. We're focused just on the housing portion. We provide some technical support. There's all kinds of data as well as peer meetings for folks that are working on these issues. We'll be providing data on helping to assess racially disparate impacts as well. And then, again, here's some of our website information. Though if you go to the Commerce website, you can find your way to all of these things. But there's a lot of information out there. And then things coming up we'll be doing, we will have some guidance on accessory dwelling units, both attached and detached guidance. That's coming up very shortly. And then some guidance on land capacity, how to figure out, well, if I've got 25,000 units, just a number, that I need to plan for, well, how does that fit into the land? So it'll be some guidance about how to think about those things. And then we have, we'll have guidance coming up, and we've already actually started working with some communities on this about racially disparate impacts, how to figure that out. What does that mean, and what kind of data do you need to look at to figure that, and what things does that trigger in our thought process for helping make our communities good places to live for lots of people. So we also have a photo library, shows examples of middle housing, and we'll be adding to that. As you probably know, this middle housing exists in all parts of the state. You go to, say, a city like Walla Walla, old city for Washington state purposes. In eastern Washington, yes, they have a housing shortage. They recently adopted regulations that allow up to 4 units on every lot. And they didn't do that because they had to. They did it because they saw a need. They saw people weren't able to afford the housing they needed. They wanted the people that worked there to be able to live there. And so they made that choice and moved forward a couple years ago. So anyway, we have pictures of some of their housing, and there's plenty of others out there as well, some new, some older. We'll be providing what we call a toolkit of standards and examples, kind of graphically oriented. So we're working with a consultant, one that I think you are familiar with, their book on missing middle housing, Opticos. That's the consultant that we're working with. And we'll be providing those to your staff, and we'll be coming back with that. And the idea with the toolkit is not that it's a one-size-fits-all. It's not a model ordinance. It's a toolkit. It will have parts. It'll say, here's the different middle housing types. Here's some definitions. You can use those. You can choose which of those fit in which types of neighborhoods, or the different things that need to apply. That's up to each community. Or you can say, no, thanks, I don't like that. I'm going to come up with our own entirely different. That's fine too. But we wanted to be helpful and see if there's something out of that could be useful for you. So let's see, what else do we have? Oh, so just a little reminder, we have a technical team, and I think you heard that I'm one of those people, a semi-retired director of a department, other cities, and I've also worked for the state in various roles. So I'm doing this on a short-term basis because the need is critical and the time is short. So I'm here to help. You also have a regional planner from our agency that may be coming again to visit you about the periodic update. But this might not be the last time you see me. So with that, and I'm really pleased to work with your staff. They're great people. Thank you. And if you have any questions for me or for Mark or Aaron, that's great too. If you just want to talk.
Seeing no questions from the other commissioners, question for either Aaron or Mark. How would you characterize what has been done with whatever resources Newcastle has been devoting over, say, what, last 10 years or some reasonable period of time? We've had these incentives in place where perhaps a certain amount of money has gone to the fostering of affordable housing through ARCH. What has that led to? Can you give us a sense for what our piece may have accomplished, or, you know, what did it contribute to in terms of increasing the supply of affordable housing? Whether in Newcastle or just anywhere. I know that, or at least I understand that the money that might come from our projects might not be spent in Newcastle. It might be spent someplace in a city that is close by where there's better connections to mass transit, for example, which I can understand that. But can you speak to that at all?
It sounds like a question for me, so I'll start, but I don't want to start and preclude other opinions by any means, being that I've only been here since September. So keeping that in mind. From what I've seen professionally, the market specific to Newcastle and the area is really good at the upper end, you know, waterline condos, for instance, the commons, and very good at the lower density end, single family homes. And then no real provisions about the subjects that we're talking about. If I portray it, it's like halfway there, and it portrays the need, or the need to look at the existing policies statewide. But it's a spectrum. So if you view it as two dumbbells on the end, everything matters in between. We're looking at missing middle housing as a category, ADUs, but also those other tools that the city of Newcastle has already had, and then measuring the effectiveness of that. So this conversation is not a replacement for that by any means, but as you look at the MFT or ADUs or the inclusionary housing next door, our participation in the region with ARCH, because housing is a regional issue, measured against that as it targets very specific elements and levels of income, but it's the whole spectrum that we're talking about. So in that context, not prepared to talk about 10 years of efficacy, haven't been here. But you have the tools in place that I've seen elsewhere that matter very much in that conversation. And the need is highlighted already in your policies and comprehensive plan. For the very low, and moderate, the market's not doing it. For everything above that, the market's doing really well. So to implement the policies that you already have in your comprehensive plan, you need to look at these tools, see how they can be revised, augmented to fit the Newcastle community, see what else is available, talk about them, and then put them in place if they fit.
And I know that that's part of the work that we need to do over the next several months, but I'd like to get a sense of what have we already done that has actually made a difference. So, for example, we have Newcastle Commons, big development. Those developers, I imagine, had to put either create affordable housing units within the development or contribute a sum of money to ARCH or to some fund where that could be used for that. Same for the water line development and any other developments like that. So do we have any sense for the amount of money that Newcastle generated that went for that purpose, and where and what resulted from that money? Is there any way to answer that?
So I believe we do have that data. I don't have it off the top of my head, and it could be sent out to the commission. I know specifically on Waterline, I was actually looking at their development agreement today. In lieu of putting in, and our downtown only requires moderate income housing units, they paid $532,000 to some in lieu fee account, which I'm not sure where that goes. Maybe it goes to Arch, but I don't believe so. So I would be happy to to get the details for you. But it seems that, well, I know like the Commons has an Avalon community, and Avalon tends to put in affordable housing units, from my understanding, and as did Tria, but it's usually like 3, 4. It's not very many at all.
One of the challenges that I think you're aware of is trying to find the sweet spot. If a city requires more low-income housing than what that builder can build and still make it work, make it pencil, it's not going to happen. It will not happen at all. You'll have no housing there, or only, very upper-end housing. So that's the challenge. What's the sweet spot of what you can require versus what can be built feasibly? And finding that, and then also just making sure that there are enough places where you can put, or somebody can put, multifamily housing. I think, as you know, Arch has been around for quite a while. They do a lot, but not a huge amount, because they don't have the resources either. Every city puts in a little bit, and then they take all that money and kind of try to cram it together. They find a good project. They never build anything by themselves. They add to something that's already there, because it takes a lot. It takes a lot. Usually any low-income housing that's beyond, say, 2 or 3 units that maybe in an individual development, usually there's a lot of different subsidies and grants and nonprofits and so on that have worked to make that happen. But if you didn't have the land available for them, then they couldn't even do that. So that's a part of it.
I can ask you a question and see the intent of that question. If you're looking at it holistically, we have the tools, we have some symbolic representation of efficacy, but it's woefully low. It's not addressing the problem. And on that level, that's easy to describe.
Shane, you, first of all, thank you for your presentation. Very helpful. I know 90% more now than I did before about that topic, so thank you for that. You mentioned there's a sweet spot. You mentioned, I think, Walla Walla has done some recent changes. Mm-hmm. What we're being asked to do essentially is to revise, update our rules for building in Newcastle so we can provide middle housing in the city. We're not the first city that's been asked to do that. Cities across Washington State have been asked. I'd love to, do you have an example of where that's gone well, that we could kind of say, oh, that's a great example? Mm-hmm. I mean, like in America, right, we have different states that reacted to COVID differently, right? Mm-hmm. Some worked out, some of them, they kind of just had 50 different approaches.
Right.
In Washington, we have lots of cities. So do you have states or cities that you would point to say, you know what, if Newcastle did what that place did, they'd be head the right direction, or if Newcastle did what that city did, golly gee, that wouldn't work at all.
Well, I can give you a few examples in Washington. And again, this is still fairly new in Washington, so we don't have a huge amount of examples, and I don't have one that I can say, oh, this is ideal. This will absolutely just adopt this and it'll work perfectly for Newcastle. But I can say, not only has Walla Walla done this, and it's working. They've got more things getting built. And the neighbors aren't coming unglued or anything. It seems to be working out. You have the city of Spokane, also Eastern Washington, biggest city in the so-called Inland Empire. And they just adopted an interim ordinance to require allowing middle housing. Obviously, property owners can still decide, I don't want to change, but if they want to, they will be allowed to build middle housing up to 4 units, depending on the location, and even more in certain cases. So that seems to be working pretty well. Seattle has allowed some middle housing. They're still working through what they need to do and trying to improve their product. Tacoma has policies in place that they're going to be working on the regulations to make this happen. So they've got policies in place to allow middle housing throughout their residential neighborhoods. Do they have it adopted yet? No, but they do have the policies that council adopted unanimously. And now they're working out the details. So we'll probably be looking at some of those examples as well.
Looks like no other questions. Thank you very much, Shane.
Thank you.
Next item on our general business is the wireless update from Director Hoffman.
If we can ask one more question before we move on to the next item, it might be informative as where we go next. So part of that update is that, as you know, in January, we negotiated a contract with SCJ and their subconsultants to do the 2-year periodic update. The timelines and deadlines for the other commerce grants don't easily match that, but the conversation does. So between now and June, we're working with Shane and other groups to focus on the deliverables for the commerce grants. But by way of example, a deliverable for missing middle housing is to have a draft ordinance in, I don't want to say in place, to have one by June to fulfill that deliverable. But we're not going to take it through SEPA or public hearings or bring it to the city council. What we're going to do is have it evolved in an informative way and then use it as part of the periodic update conversation as an example of how it could work in Newcastle, or at the very least, what sections of the code would be affected, what amendments or revisions would be needed for the various housing types. And then along with the toolkit and the mapping, possible tours, and the general conversation, you could see the opportunities for Newcastle, whether it's ADU and duplex, whether it's a higher level, but to focus on the housing types as it fits into the context and the scale of single-family development and the neighborhoods where the transit is, how the legislation in Olympia may mandate that, and then have a very or better informed conversation July, August, September as part of the periodic update. So we're heading towards both. We need to do some work rapidly, but we're not getting out in front of you. It will be in draft form to address missing middle housing and displacement and so forth, and then we'll include it in the conversations that we have here. So the question, before we leave the topic, is how do we facilitate that? How do we take advantage of these regular meetings in March and April and bring you what you need in a timely fashion so it's not all thrown upon you at the beginning of the summer? This round, and thank you again to Commerce, there's more resources and data and tools available for the periodic update and housing element than I've ever seen. And so I don't want to lose an opportunity to take advantage of them. We're grant recipients, we're taking advantage of it. But I want to include you in the conversation. We'll meet with the chair in a couple weeks and discuss the next meeting and the specific agenda. But I wanted to give you an opportunity of where do you want to look? Where do you want to start and begin down that conversation road?
I guess I'd like to understand really what is being done and what information can we expect to get through engagement of Newcastle residents specifically on this issue. I've been having a lot of conversations with people about this very issue, and I'm getting very consistent and relatively strong thoughts about it, and that's anecdotal. I'd like to understand, is there a theme or a thread, or are there strong feelings that are consistent across our community around this issue? I think that's going to be an important part of this discussion. I know that we had discussions before the first of the year, and I think they contemplated that part of the process would be community outreach, and I think really understanding what the community more broadly thinks. I can sit here and I can tell you what the people I've talked to have said, but I guess I'd like to know more completely, what opportunity is there for that?
And I'll just let you know that we are, our SCJ is already starting to work on the community engagement portion. They're working on a plan right now, and I'm working directly on the community business organization standpoint, part of the housing grant. And we just selected a CBO to lead that effort. So we're getting that going, but yeah, it's coming.
That's good to hear. So, because if we had a meeting right here, on whatever evening, there might be people here, but more often than not, what I've seen, it's kind of a recurring theme of the same folks that go up to the events. And I'm wondering, can we leverage like the Chamber of Commerce, they've already got tapped into some resources around here, but also we have all these HOAs where, reach out to there's what, a dozen, 20 HOAs, reach out to them, say, hey, do you guys want to be involved? I feel like, I know we talk about outreach and we talk about trying to get the community involved, and we host a thing and 6 people show up, right? It's a big event at the library. It's all over Facebook. Oh, you didn't hear about it? It happened last night. It was great. There were 8 people. I'm being facetious, but I feel like we need to make a real concerted effort to engage the existing communities that are going to be most, like Scott mentioned, have the most interest in this, but typically don't attend, the events we have at the library or, those types of events. There was really good attendance at the thing we had at the golf course. It was a packed house. But aside from that, I haven't seen a whole lot of engagement. So I think if we can leverage, the HOAs, the community, the commerce, Chamber of Commerce folks, that'd be my recommendation. And I'd just be curious to see what is it, SCJ, what are they proposing? Because as somebody that's spent the past few years trying to get people engaged, I know it's tough. And I'd hate for them to, hit some brick walls that we could help them avoid if we could just get a feel for what they're doing. Thanks for your work on that, Aaron.
That actually is one of the elements, regardless of which particular issue we're going to be talking about or addressing. One of the overlaps is that outreach. So if you look at phase 1 of the scope for SCJ, it's that outreach and engagement. We're not going to do 3 tracks and kill everyone with endless meetings that nobody goes to. So if there's an opportunity to have one meeting in an independent venue and deal with 3 different items and collect that input, that's the plan. So in the next week, we're tasked with getting a suggested list of not the frequent flyers, not just mayor and council and commission. Those are naturals. The SCJ is going to interview those parties, but specifically a list of contacts so that they come to town, sit with us, meet with those people, and begin that outreach, and then obtain those comments and directives. I guess the missing link then, if it's front-loaded for all these efforts and we get it, how best to communicate it to you and the council, or at least capture it and record it so that it is, something other than we held an event. Maybe not to the level of a survey or, statistically relevant type document, but something that can be useful as input to you as you go through this process. So that part we don't have identified. But as far as the meetings, the venues, the need, the overlap, that they will occur and that a plan will be in place and that we'll assist with, that is that first phase. But if you have any ideas on how to, other than to attend, we encourage that. Nothing like firsthand, but we'll keep in mind how to keep that record so that when everything is kicked up to City Council, they have the pleasure of viewing and hearing about all that too.
First of all, thank you, Shane. It was a very informative presentation. And for me, I think it's kind of exciting. I'm looking forward to the whole conversation of putting the pieces of the puzzle together to understand how we arrive at a total comprehensive look at this issue. For me, the toolbox for creating more middle housing seems, just on the surface, pretty complete. There's a lot of things that we can play with. The one thing that's missing for me is how we make it economically affordable. I haven't heard anything other than grants as to how that would happen. And certainly for a developer of a lot with 4 to 6 units on it is not going to be able to take 25 or 30 or 40% of their inventory and make it affordable. So I don't know how that works, and I'd be very curious about that. Thank you.
One of the other things that our agency is putting together is a pro forma model. So there'll be a pro forma tool also with this. And what that does is it will show for anyone interested in developing some property what is needed to make that feasible. So, for example, would a duplex be feasible in some places to build? Maybe, maybe not. Would a quadruplex be feasible? Maybe. Again, so trying to put together that information. So it's based on market research. So we've hired Cascadia Partners to work on that. And we'll be putting that, finishing touches on that as well the next couple months. But that would, again, provide a tool. Your director or others can also look at it and say, well, we know what our value of land is in here, and these things will figure. And so it will be a tool that provides for lot sizes and so on. Is it going to tell you everything for every single parcel? No, but it's a market tool to tell you, is it feasible for certain types of housing to occur?
Shane, before you go, I have a question. What's been your experience with the parking issue? One of the main things we have in our neighborhood is parking. Everybody's got all this stuff in the garage, they're parking in the streets. That's a complaint we hear over and over. My neighbor's got their cars in there. Blah, 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 blah. So how have you seen that play out from your perspective?
Well, certainly parking does tend to get people working hard on what the solutions are. Parking is a big issue. A lot of times communities are now looking at, say, requiring one parking space per unit. Because sometimes on-street parking supplements that. But many of the middle housing types are not going to be 2,000, 3,000 square foot homes with several people living there. There's going to be 1 or 2 people. In most cases, and you probably don't need a lot of additional parking. So 1 space per unit is probably good practice.
Is that realistic? I mean, if you have, I don't know, a 4-plex or a 12-plex, whatever it would be, and it's got, a family, and the kid's got a car, and the dad's got a car, and the mom's got a car. I hope that would be ideal, but I'm speaking to these folks as much as to you. Just want to get the question in your ears so we can get some feedback maybe from Mark and Aaron.
This will be a big deal, and obviously you guys are going to work on this more. But what I can say is that I've, over the years, seen a lot of things, and I've seen detached houses where, yes, they have 4 teenagers and everybody's got at least 1 car in addition to the parents. Is that common? Does that mean you should plan for 6 parking spaces per unit? Probably not. It's a temporary situation in most cases for an individual home to have a lot of people. But when you look at the size of housing, when you look at the number of people in households today, do you know how many single-person households we have? More than 1/3 of all households are 1 person. 1 person. So should we plan for having parking to suit the larger family? And everybody has to meet that standard? Maybe not. So again, maybe it ties to the size of the unit. How many people would be likely to live in a size of a unit? So those are kinds of things that I think your staff will be bringing back some more information, but that's a really key question.
I guess I'd like to jump in on that a little bit too, which is, I hear what you're saying. I think I have 2 kind of separate thoughts that I guess I want to call out. First of all, for affordable housing, it seems to me that if we're really serious about, providing housing that is going to be serving lower income families, I think there needs to be a proximity to public transit. And I think as a community, we're very limited in terms of how we're serviced by public transit. And I guess I question the benefit of, or the theory that having high density housing a long ways away, a 1.5 mile away walk from the closest bus stop is really helping is really accommodating those homes. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me. And I guess the other thing I heard you say was that you talked about this pro forma that was talking about how it could be feasible to build these multifamily units on these lots. And I guess my concern would be developers, I don't think are typically looking for what's feasible. They're looking to maximize revenue. And I'm going to guess that if there's an opportunity to build 2, 3, 4 units on one lot that previously was a single family restricted detached house unit or lot, they're going to look to maximize value. And if you can have, you know, $1 million house there, or have 4 units that are each $700,000 because they're really high end with high end finishes, and you know, they're able to maximize value that way. I think developers are going to lean that way, and they're going to pay the fee to whatever fund. And to me, that doesn't seem like that's addressing the issue either. So I guess I point both of those points out because, you know, I think we really need to be thinking about this in a really integrated way. It needs to go just beyond how do we get multifamily housing available. Just putting, you know, 3plexes in because there's a lot next door, does that solve the problem? Or is that really accomplishing what we think it should accomplish? And I guess I'd rather focus on some of these other issues as part of the solution rather than just the number of units. And I'm not suggesting, Shane, that that's all you're focusing on at all. And I appreciate where you're coming from, and I appreciate your presentation. But I just don't want that to get lost in the discussion.
And one item with that, as planners, certainly not an architect or a builder, but we need to have that conversation because we're not just going to throw a unit count or a density in there and say, hey, let's see if it works. So as you approach it, I think the important element, at least for me in learning how to talk about this, and I'm still very much learning, it's the unit size that's different. It's the single family zone and exploring those opportunities. So when I first started this, I pictured, you know, you jack up the densities and wow, that's overpowering because I'm viewing it as the single family size that we see. But it's those pocketed infill around transportation, around parks, around bus stops, where that maintains the 2.5-story bulk and mass and dimensions. And the toolkit that we'll show along with the housing types for you to consider has those dimensions, shows how they fit on a lot size, also shows bulk and mass, and then goes further with the photos, shows you what it looks like and how it could fit into a single family neighborhood in that context and not resemble what I feared, which is 4 monster homes crammed onto one very small lot. So I think it's that context, and then the opportunity is there. Also, what it's not is it's not subsidized affordable housing. This is market rate. So if in theory it comes about, the economics are there. And I hate using this word, it does pencil out. But that's that conversation and toolkit that we'll bring to allow that discussion.
Can we go back for a second to the schedule of how things are going to occur? You mentioned that working with the grant and working toward a June deadline so that after June we'll have information about what ordinances might be affected, what possible tools we could put into effect, some options essentially that we could start talking about. What is the timeline for getting community engagement? Is it before June? Is it between now and June? So would we have that community input by the time we have that conversation?
For me, it's how to record it and get it to you, how to use it. This effort with SCJ and the staff, fortunately we're a small city, we'll get it. Entire phase 1 of SCJ's scope is outreach and engagement, but they're on a 2-year process. What we don't want is to end up with a draft comp plan like we see in the past. We notice it, hey, we may adopt it, and then you get a room full of people saying, I didn't know about it, I know nothing that's in it, I don't support it, you know, why weren't we involved? This entire 2-year process is exactly designed so that March, April, and May is that involvement. to the greatest extent we can, and then to
This
keep
March,
involved.
April, and May.
Exactly. So in 3 weeks, we'll sit with SCJ and have very specific venues, dates, times, and purposes. When we have that, we're going to use those opportunities to talk about missing middle housing and adapt meetings so that there's 3 purposes. While we have people in the room, if we can get people in the room, and maximize that awareness and comment, then the mission becomes how do we record it and get it for use, right? Ideally, it would be in this room, right? In a commission setting, deal with all these topics and discussions with everyone together, but I don't think we're going to get much participation from the public in this setting until later in the process. So phase 1 of SCJ in the city is to maximize that. The advantage is that timeline matches the Commerce Grant and deliverables and outreach that's due in June. The obligation does not mean that we need to adopt or even officially consider an ordinance by then. We just need to have it. And then the advantage is we can use it over the next year and a half and maintain that involvement and that engagement.
Is a survey part of that, is part of the plan for March, April, and June? Is that?
The initial discussion, one part that we had our initial meeting last week. So we wanted to focus on engagement and next steps and how do we get out in the community and which groups and who can we invite? Please provide us a list. We said yes. And then we just head nodded in agreement. Survey is part of the scope. Website, part of the scope. And so it'll all start coming together. But at the end of March, the main element or the main item is they're coming to town. They're bringing their crew. They're going to work with us. And they're going to sit and interview and elicit feedback from anyone they can get interested in this process. So our first task is provide them with those connections. The easy ones, mayor, council, and commission. But we're going way beyond that. I'm happy their focus is those that aren't typically involved and making them first and foremost a priority, because then I think it gets at what Commissioner Quigg said.
Jim, if you wouldn't mind, just let me,
Go for it, Charlie.
let me run this to the end of my line of inquiry. The questions they'll be asking in the interviews and possibly in the survey I presume those will be presented to you before they go out and do it. They'll say, this is what we intend to ask these people. Am I correct?
Everything goes through internally through staff.
Will we have an opportunity to see what the questions are going to be?
In a transparency aspect, absolutely. But as far as involvement, it's independent. Their intent is to come to town and listen to these groups and representatives and so forth and get that free-form, independent, not through the city type lens involvement. That's step 1. They'll have plenty of opportunity to meet and talk with you. But as far as forming those questions, the more productive way, we know where we're facing, we know which elements. Out of the gate, they're not going to sit with elements in the community and say, this is what we're doing. It's very broad. They're going to say, hey, what's working? What's not working? What are your concerns? What do you like? What do you hate? Do you have anything to tell us? But there's also an element of awareness. Letting people know what this process is, what their involvement is from the very beginning, and not when city council's looking at a binder saying, should we adopt it or not? So you want to leave that first step independent. We'll be there recording, but we're not forging the path. That initial outreach has to be very broad and independent, like a listening board for SCJ. Where we go from there, how you want to use it, what questions you have is a natural course of action. Every comp plan has that. Every comp plan update.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to understand better is those questions and how they're going to get at the middle housing issue. And are there going to be specific questions that will get to it? I mean, for example, it might be interesting to ask Newcastle some of the questions that were asked on some of the statewide surveys that we've heard about and get a comparison to see how Newcastle compares to those other places. So if there were a survey being put out, and if it were possible to get some comparative data, that would be, I think that would contribute to our understanding, my understanding anyway. But that's, I understand it needs to be an independent effort. I welcome them doing it and just, and asking open-ended questions and having it come back so that we get that unfiltered.
And that's SCJ's role. So the opportunity is, in that same meeting, we're done with that. Okay, now, city staff who are tasked, for mostly budget reasons, with the missing middle housing element, can then take that next course of action, and we can work with you, commission and staff, to frame a conversation. What I don't want to do is get bogged down to what's statistically relevant and wordsmith to death 17 questions that represent the community, but the opportunity is there. SCJ is not tasked with that because we want to keep the periodic update budget low, and the deadline did not match their timeline. So if an element of those initial meetings includes staff time to address missing middle housing and ask your question, that's the opportunity.
Yeah, I just want to be sure that they're asking questions that are going to get us the same kind of input that we're asking our neighbors. Jim talked about the people he's talking to, and I'm assuming that they are going to do that because we're all looking for the same thing. But it would feel good to know that they are going to be asking, and it would be great if they submit questions to share those with us so we can see what they're asking the community.
Not initially, yeah. We are not paying them for the missing middle housing element. It's not in their scope. For the housing element and for the periodic update, that's in their scope. We'll be uniquely combined in a venue, in a setting. Internally, we're doing missing middle housing between now and June. We can ask those questions. You can give us those questions informally, formally, but let's not create a bureaucratic survey report outside the scope of SCJ. But if you want us to ask particular questions, just get them to us. We'll be there. The first part of the meeting will be SCJ's periodic update independent portion, what they're being paid or reimbursed to do. The second and third part can be whatever we need in the presence of the public, and then condense it in some way that people don't die of boredom, or lose interest. But that's how we want to maximize those meetings.
Jim was waiting.
I'd just like to make sure that one of the questions that's asked is, how do you feel about a four units in the lot next to yours? It's a pretty straightforward question. That seems to be the direction we're going, we're going to increase the density for the middle housing. And that's a question that should be asked. And I was a bit surprised. I can't remember where I read this, but I read somewhere there was a survey that people said, no big deal. But I'd like to hear that from our citizens. And I suspect parking's going to be part of it.
If I may, the city of Bellevue did a very comprehensive survey on missing middle housing, and that might have been where you heard that people were like, oh yeah, maybe some of this would fit in my neighborhood. But they did it with care, not to make it so that people understood that it was a house-size scale building, and that's something that we'll be working with whomever we do our surveys with and whomever we outreach with, whether it be the CBO or whatnot. We're going to have to be very careful about that too.
I think I would be curious too to discuss more about, at what point do we discuss where realistically are we thinking these are going to go? Because I think a broad question like that, I don't know if we're really there yet. Are we really saying, any property is going to have any size? I haven't heard that. The memo that you gave us attached to this agenda talked about ADUs, it talked about cottage housing, it talked about townhomes. And I actually found those really interesting because you connected those to the current ordinances. And so I learned more about what is our current information about ADUs. And I think, I don't know if we're going to have a chance to do that in the timeline really talk about, well, I think even in the memo, it talked about the location of the townhomes would be pretty singular. It's not like that would be allowed everywhere. And to your point about the fourplex, I don't think we're, unless I'm not hearing it, we're not saying, let's do that everywhere. You know what I'm saying? I think there's going to be a little bit more planning. And
I was just responding to the legislation that's in committee that we were told might possibly come our direction and be mandated, and that part of the toolbox that we could use is to put a fourplex on a, or a sixplex on a single-family housing unit. Not that we're going to do it, and not that the legislature has done it, but it's a pretty radical change, and I think that would be something that would be worth, through this exercise, carefully exploring how people feel about it.
Well,
So I think you're right, it's not mandated, it's just part of the toolbox or the potentials that we see out there.
I would like to gather information about ADUs, because that's something that's specific to people's property that they currently have. It would be interesting to know if people are interested in building one. My husband and I looked at it, we decided against it, but, you know, information like, what was the other one? ADUs, well, transit too, understanding people's ideas, like are they excited about the light rail going in, or they need transportation to get to that South Bellevue station to get to their employers in Seattle? I'm curious, what are people thinking about transit? Are they wanting more buses? Anyway, those come to mind, as well as these broader issues.
We'll know a lot more about what may or may not be mandated by April. That changes the discussion, but even so, as currently written, that has its own timelines. 6 months you shall this, model ordinances, so there's time. There's no situation where in June we'll be forced or have to adopt anything. But the advantage of the grant is that we'll have that education, that discussion, see what we're faced with mandates by then, and then be able to incorporate it in, or not be subject to it because of city size, or that the language changes and, you know, the parking requirements change between now and April. Right now it's written in schools, parks, and near some of our planned bus infrastructure along 405. But we'll know more then. But even then, if that mandate passes, there's time. So that conversation can be wrapped into this current planning process of periodic update. I don't want to do it twice. So if there's mandates, we would approach that this summer as part of this effort so that we're not duplicating that. But the only pressure is the deliverables on the grant. It's a draft ordinance, and that's just a conversation. And then it can be seen, its effects, or what it looks like, or how parking has to be handled. So we have time between now and then, but what we can't afford to do is just sit back and say, let's wait and see what House bill comes out of the legislature, because as a city, as you look at these different housing types, somewhere between single family and subsidized low arch type projects and multifamily tax exemptions, there are opportunities based on housing type. And some cities a year ago, 2 years ago, started to take it on, not as a mandate, but voluntary, and choosing from that menu. Let's go ADUs and duplexes, that seems to fit here. And then drafting a code like Spokane where that local control but voluntary provision of these housing types can take place. If it's mandated, it's mandated, but then we have time. So no matter where we're at this summer, that conversation will have taken place.
Hey, anybody have anything else they want to add to this?
It was about the memo that was attached to the agenda. What was the purpose or the context behind it? Like, I took it, I think I read it as, oh, this is like a first round of what's being recommended that we take a look at first. And those units were mentioned, like duplexes weren't in there, triplexes, fourplexes. Was that purposeful, or was that, did I read too much into the memo? Was it just some ideas, but the things that weren't included, don't worry about it?
Yeah, so the memo was just to kind of inform everybody, okay, so this is where we are. We've done all these things, and these are some things that we could additionally do. And then having Shane come and speak to us, kind of just having that understanding before it started. It was really high level, yeah.
Okay, we can move on to wireless, but I want to withdraw my request to you, Aaron, to do that little bit of research about the money that went to Arch. I mean, that's a nice to know, but we don't, it's not material, and we don't need to have you waste time on it. It's not going to change anything here, so save the effort. Okay, let's move to wireless. Thanks, Shane.
Next item, short discussion and a little update. The update is that we are a day or so away from having a contract signed with Daniel Kenny. I'm brain dead at this point. Ogden Murphy Wallace. He is a subject matter expert, has done this for handfuls of cities in jurisdictions. So he has quite a track record. Due to budgeting and what I understand the effort to be, that fulfills the work plan and why I believe we're doing this. And that's that small cell, the aesthetics, the rules, the shot clock, the fees. We will capture that with this contract. He will analyze our existing codes. He'll come up with some suggestions or a sampling of alternatives, and then we will include the commission and the public and approach it that way towards any sort of draft ordinance. The work plan shows it to be in the second and third quarter of this year. If we have a contract in place next week, I'll sit with him about his first steps. That obviously is look at our existing code. He's a subject matter expert. It's not going to take long. So one of your next meetings can be that introduction. So that's the update, and it's funded. What's not funded? Our existing code and how it applies to macro cell towers, any processes and so forth. Somewhat dated. Last date I see on there is 2013. It seems shameful to just look at the wireless ordinance just in the context of small cell, but I wasn't here when the item originated. So I feel that's the primary intent of the update, but we shouldn't lose the opportunity to look at the rest of the code and the process, internally integrate the code wherever we can, and staff and a work group have that resource. There's a independent group that I've used as a sounding board representing the industry. I would characterize it as they're highly interested because they do this stuff. They're highly involved. The primary contact is a former council member for the city of Redmond, and she now integrates these types of issues on behalf of the different service providers. They bring that perspective. Often the perspective is, we don't like what you're doing, but if you're going to do it to us, this is how you do it. So between the small cell from Daniel Kenny, the staff look at other jurisdictions and what we bring to the table, looking at your existing code, and then this industry board plus whatever comes from the public would represent that update effort, hopefully done by end of third quarter at whatever pace you want. So then the next step, I guess, or the question becomes, how would you like it to be introduced to you when Daniel is ready to talk about it? It's pretty detailed. Gets into quite a slideshow of FCC interpretations and requirements, and you'll become subject matter experts quickly.
I think I just want to know what it looks like. You know, what are the options? It's going to look like a garbage can. It's going to look like a light pole. You know, that kind of thing is the most, I think, important for folks who are citizens driving down the road. Since I understand these can be every, what, 1/10 of a mile, quite closely placed together. So very little technical, but more aesthetic would be my concern.
That's amazing. I did not see Commissioner Quigg's lips move at all while you were saying that.
What I'll do then is second quarter starts in 4 weeks. I'll sit in March with Daniel Kenny, let him do his work, and then give the presentation that I've seen to the commission, tailored to Newcastle and not Bainbridge or Snoqualmie. But let him start with that. You give him feedback about how technical you want or whatever questions you have, but then focus on the aesthetics. He certainly has seen every spot on the horizon on up to Bainbridge Island, which essentially provides a citizen committee review. So you'll have that spectrum and you can decide process, permitting, noticing, citizen involvement, but you'll have to weigh it against the regulations, what the FCC says we can regulate and what we can't. And so when he starts that conversation, then emphasize aesthetics and any worries about what they look like. Garbage cans or robots on every pole. We can regulate aesthetics, but only to a certain extent. He'll ask you some very key questions about what kind of process you want, who do you want to do that process, and go from there. So maybe, I'm not sure if you'll be ready for the March meeting, but certainly right after that. I have another question. Our city clerk provided some minutes and an agenda from a 2020 meeting. Dave Vanderweg, senior planner, was here and started this issue. In viewing that, it's a great base. The comments are there, but it doesn't take it to any sort of draft language or list of amendments or anything like that. So I'm assuming there's no technical work like that we need to give to Daniel. It's just clean as an issue, and that what I've conveyed tonight fulfills what you view this effort to be at the commission so that you could make a recommendation to council. I wasn't here in the last 4 years on why this was so important that it stayed on the work plan but never progressed.
I think it stayed on the work plan because staff advised us that there was federal regulation that was required. I mean, this was going to happen and we needed to have some rules if we were going to have any influence over how this was going to be done in our city. And I don't know if 5G has come to Newcastle yet. I suspect it really hasn't yet. But it's on the agenda because we've never been disabused of that notion that this is something that we really got to take care of. Otherwise, it's going to roll over us at some point in a way that we're not going to be able to influence. Anybody else have any recollection about that?
That's exactly what I recall. And the other thing was that it got put on the back burner because of some other issue that came up. And so we had to say, no, we can't go any further until we resolve the other issue.
Yeah, mostly staff shortages.
Okay, I give that.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, just agree. Yeah, I think the sense was that there was a gap. There was a gap we needed to fill, and other things just continue to be elevated above it. But it still needs to be addressed. Was my understanding. Yeah.
There was a moment with King County planning directors where we were all panicked for that very reason, and that probably reflects that time period because everyone thought the latest thing was going to be unraveled and in our door for permitting yesterday. That never came about, and then the mindset was, yes, you need to do this because the FCC declarations, but you have a little bit more time as a small city because you're not going to be the first. Let's wait, benefit from the learning curve of Seattle and Bellevue, and see what really is mandated and lawsuits being resolved. And now I'm hearing input that yes, it's coming. It's important to have in your books before it goes through your front door to your permit counter, but that it's not rolling out for a variety of reasons as was expected. So this year seems like we could take a very deliberate, non-rushed process and get it in place before the end of the year and be ahead of whatever that industry puts in place for this region.
Okay, I think that closes off that general business issue. It brings us to our second public comment period of the evening. Again, there's no one in the audience. Is there anybody online that may be waiting to make a comment?
There is not.
And we will close the public comment period. We have our next regular planning commission meeting. Director Hoffman mentioned the meeting with me. We have a regular meeting a couple of weeks in advance just to talk about what's coming so that I can advise Mark and Aaron about what I think you guys would be wanting to hear about. Other than that, I don't know of any other special meetings, so.
A little bit further down the horizon, besides all that stuff we just threw your way, the conversation about community design is also on the work plan. So we haven't had a discussion with SCJ enough for that to be formed. We envision that as part of that process, but let's focus on engagement and outreach. I think a lot of the feedback and comment initially is going to be that issue. And then what we'd like to do as a work item for commission, take those comments, be responsive to it, and then have that community conversation however you would like to have it. SCJ has it in their scope. They would be here in this setting. It would be a public process, as much comment as you need, as much reflection or investigation as you need. It's curious how it's called a conversation. I don't know where it's going to lead, but it certainly will lead to policy, examining what policies are in place in the comp plan and what could be in there or should be in there or can be proposed there. So that's where the likely result will go. Whether anything results from it is up to you and whatever your recommendation is. But I imagine that process tailed with comp plan update and SCJ and that public involvement will fulfill that work item for you this year. But I'm open to any involvement, subcommittee suggestions, this venue, how to promote that conversation, how to maximize the conversation. Are we having the right conversation? Whether it's the downtown master plan or any other element that you or the community are concerned of, we're open to that to facilitate.
I like the idea of starting with the feedback that is gathered by the consultants. Go from there.
Okay.
Other than that, there's nothing else on the planning calendar.
And with nothing else in the planning calendar, we are at the point where we can adjourn, so I will declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you all.